Welcome to the We've Seen a Thing or Two podcast. As investigators and mediators focused on regulatory and workplace conflicts, we have seen a thing or two and learned a thing or two. In each episode, we will be speaking with industry leaders in regulation, human resources and law, as well as thought leaders and top performers in investigations and mediation. We bring our audience interesting and cutting-edge information on conflict management as it relates to professional regulation and workplace disputes. This industry is one of many views, and we have to say that some views shared by our guests are not necessarily shared by the We've Seen a Thing or Two podcast, its host, or sponsors. Today's show is brought to you by Bernard & Associates, trusted investigation and mediation professionals since 2004. Now here's your host, Dean Bernard.
Hello again to all of you tuning into our podcast. We have another great guest today, Lara Kinkartz, who is a lawyer from Weir Foulds LLP. I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about Lara. Lara's law practice is focused on administrative, regulatory, and public law. She advises and acts as counsel to several professional and industry regulators on issues related to registration, complaints, and discipline. She also acts in civil litigation matters for various public and private sector clients and has particular knowledge in the areas of professional self-regulation, judicial review of government decision-making, liquor regulation, and access to information and privacy. From 2017 to 2019, Lara was seconded from her firm to act as Associate Commission Counsel to the Public Inquiry into the safety and security of residents in long-term care home systems. The inquiry's mandate was to inquire into the events which led to the offences committed by Elizabeth Wettlaufer, the Ontario nurse who murdered numerous residents in long-term care homes. Now, Lara's involvement in the inquiry is one of the reasons I wanted her to come on the show. Lara had a unique role and view of the inquiry, and I thought she would have some interesting insights to share with our audience. So with all of that, welcome to the show, Lara, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Dean. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, as I mentioned, one of the reasons I wanted to have you as a guest on the show is to discuss the unique role you played during the public inquiry. Perhaps maybe you could start with telling our audience a little bit about the case and what led to the inquiry.
Sure. So Elizabeth Wettlaufer became a registered nurse in the mid-90s, and shortly after she started working in the long-term care setting, which was around 2007, she began intentionally harming patients in her care by overdosing them with insulin. And that went on for 9 years until September of 2016, when she abruptly resigned from her nursing job and checked herself into the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. While she was there, she confessed to her psychiatrist and then repeated her confession to the police. When she was asked, she claimed that she had turned herself in because her supervisor was considering placing her in schools to assist diabetic children with their insulin. And she said she was worried she would hurt a child. So fast forwarding to June of 2017, Wettlaufer ended up pleading guilty and was convicted of 14 offenses, including 8 murders, 4 attempted murders, and 2 aggravated assaults.
Wow. And I remember this was hot in the press at that time. And so I guess an obvious question out of this is, how was she able to get away with this for so long?
Yeah, that's a question that a lot of people were asking and that the inquiry spent a lot of time looking into. And it turns out there are probably a few reasons she was able to get away with her crimes undetected for nearly a decade. For one thing, if you plot all of her offenses on a timeline, what you'll see is that they were relatively spread out. So the highest number of offenses she committed in any single year was 3, but most of the time it was just 1 or 2. And in Ontario long-term care homes, about 20% of the population dies every year. So in a home like the one where she committed most of her offenses, which had about 169 beds, 1 or 2 extra deaths in a year isn't going to raise any red flags given the high mortality rate to begin with. One of the other things we heard during the inquiry was that the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, which is what it was at the time, had started developing statistical models to predict the expected rate of death in each long-term care home in Ontario. And after Wettlaufer's confessions came to light, they looked at several different models they had been using to see if any of them could have detected her crimes when they were occurring. And what they found is that because her offenses were so spread out, her actions wouldn't have raised any red flags under any of the models they had.
That's very interesting. So I guess the inquiry was established really to assume a better understanding of how this could have occurred and really to develop recommendations to prevent this type of thing in the future.
Yeah, exactly. So shortly after Wettlaufer was convicted, the public inquiry was established with a mandate to inquire into the circumstances and contributing factors that allowed the offenses to occur and to make recommendations to prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future. And the way the inquiry unfolded was in two parts. The first involved public hearings, which lasted for about 10 weeks and involved 50 witnesses. And the second part of the inquiry focused on consultations with stakeholders and conducting research with a view to developing recommendations. The final report and recommendations were released on July 31st, 2019. So the inquiry had a 2-year mandate, all told.
That's interesting. And so I imagine the inquiry was to look at the day-to-day within the long-term care homes. I mean, I know the work within these homes is challenging and likely open to a lot of room for error and nefarious behaviors by anyone that's so inclined.
That's right. The staff who work in long-term care have a workload that's really staggering, partly because the long-term care population is very high needs and the acuity of residents in long-term care is only increasing. So what I found really surprising when I was working on the inquiry was what the statistics actually show, and they really help put this into perspective. In 2017, 2018, 90% of residents in long-term care had some form of cognitive impairment, and 86% needed help with basic activities like eating and using the bathroom. Both of those numbers are steadily increasing, which, as you can imagine, has a really big impact on the workload of the nurses and the other staff in these homes. So, for example, with respect to medications alone, nurses are responsible for a long list of duties like record keeping, managing inventory, ordering drugs from the pharmacy, reconciling medications when a resident is admitted, stocking medication carts, performing narcotic counts each shift, participating in quarterly medication reviews, disposing of expired meds, and the list goes on and on and on. Nurses are also responsible for conducting what's called a medication pass, which typically happens about 4 times per day. And that's when they go to all their patients and administer the medications each of them need. That's a particularly time-consuming part of their job. And to put that into perspective, for 30 residents, we were told that a typical medication pass can take between 2.5 and 3 hours because there are frequent interruptions to deal with emergencies. So if a resident falls or chokes on something, the nurse has to stop what they're doing and go and deal with that. The other thing to consider is that more than 60% of residents in long-term care take 10 or more different medications. So one nurse that testified during the inquiry's public hearings said that she would give between 400 and 600 medications on the morning medication pass alone. So with numbers like that and the sheer amount of work expected of staff, you can see how even inadvertent errors can easily happen, which makes it an ideal setting for someone who wants to deliberately harm residents.
Yeah, it sure does. And those numbers are staggering. It's not hard to see really how the situation leaves plenty of opportunity for someone to act as Wettlaufer did and really go undetected. Can you tell us a little more about how she committed her crimes?
Yeah, that's important to understand because it's another part of the reason she was able to get away with harming residents without detection for so long. What she did was use a combination of short and long-acting insulin. Short-acting insulin rapidly decreases blood sugar levels and creates hypoglycemia, and long-acting insulin continues to keep blood sugar low over a prolonged period. So even if the resident is given glucose, their blood sugar will continue to drop. Wettlaufer's decision to use insulin was part of the reason it was hard to detect her crimes, because it's very difficult to detect an insulin overdose for a few reasons. Obviously, it's a naturally occurring substance in the body. And If you die of an insulin overdose, death typically happens hours or days later. If you look at Wettlaufer's shifts, she was actually only on duty when one of her victims died. So hypothetically, even if you knew a person had died of an insulin overdose, you would have a really difficult time pegging the timing. The other factor is that symptoms of hypoglycemia or low blood sugar are the same as those of many other diseases. They're non-specific. And there's also no reliable way to test for an insulin overdose post-mortem. The other thing that was important is Wettlaufer's choice of victim. She deliberately chose victims who were vulnerable. All but one of them had cognitive impairments or dementia, and that meant they couldn't advocate for themselves, or even if they did, they were less likely to be believed. Wettlaufer also committed almost all of her offenses on the night shift. And that's important because she was typically the only registered nurse on duty during the night shift, and there would be no supervisor on site. So at those times, she would actually be the senior staff member in the home. Wettlaufer was often seen by her colleagues as sloppy, lazy, or unprofessional. But even in retrospect, none of her coworkers or managers had any suspicion that she was intentionally harming patients. And I think it's likely because of the combination of all of those factors.
I suppose, too, that since it's long-term care, as you said before, people are less likely to be suspicious since nobody's death in this setting is really all that surprising.
That's right. One of the things the inquiry found is that there's a prevalent attitude that those in long-term care are expected to die. People tend to be very sick when they enter long-term care, and they almost always have several serious illnesses. So for that reason, their deaths are usually not viewed as suspicious. And in fact, none of the deaths caused by Wettlaufer were seen as suspicious. One of her victims was actually sent to the ER because the home couldn't raise her blood sugar and nobody could figure out why. The ER doctor told the home's nursing staff that if the resident passed away, a coroner should investigate. The resident did indeed end up passing away shortly after she returned to the home from the hospital. And although the nursing staff told the local coroner what the ER doctor had said, the coroner decided not to investigate the resident's death. When that local coroner was testifying at the inquiry, what he said was that he didn't think there was such a thing as an unexpected death in long-term care because residents are so sick. So he didn't see the death as suspicious.
Wow. And of course, that's not really surprising to hear him say that. But one of the things that I've heard is really, since this whole inquiry began, is the many rumors and misconceptions that have come out. And I think there have been a lot of those, haven't there?
There definitely have. And there have been so many that one of the first things that Commissioner Gillese addresses in her report are some of the myths, because she felt it was important that everyone understood what really happened here. So a really common one is the misconception that these were somehow mercy killings. And it's important to understand that Wettlaufer never even claimed that they were mercy killings. Really, she was motivated by anger, frustration about her career, her responsibilities, and her life in general. And she described feeling a red surge before she killed and a sense of euphoria after. So in no way did she act out of mercy or compassion. The other thing that came up a lot was that the issues in our long-term care system are really the result of the baby boomer generation reaching a certain age, and down the road, the issues will just resolve themselves. And Commissioner Gillese emphasizes in the report that that's not the case, because the proportion of older Ontarians is also attributable to low birth rates and increasing life expectancy. And it's also linked to the acuity of residents. As people live longer, we have more physical and cognitive impairments, and that creates a heavier workload for the nursing and medical staff in long-term care. So that's not going to change. The other myth that came up a lot was, well, Wettlaufer's in jail now, so the threat has passed. We don't need to be worried anymore. And I think what I found the most surprising during my work on the inquiry is that there's actually a growing body of research and literature on what are called healthcare serial killers. So healthcare professionals who deliberately kill their patients. Since 1970, there have been 90 convicted healthcare serial killers in the Western world. And those 90 people are responsible for 450 deaths and causing serious bodily harm to 150 others. And those are just the ones we can prove. The actual number of suspicious deaths attributable to those people is closer to about 2,600. During the inquiry's hearings, there were actually 2 more suspected healthcare serial killers who were arrested, one in Japan and one in the UK. And then again, shortly before the inquiry's final report was released, there were news stories about a German nurse who was already in jail for attempting to kill one patient and murdering 2 others. And he was then charged and admitted to killing 97 additional patients. So all of that to say, although events like this are rare, it can't be said that this was a one-off isolated incident. The last myth that Commissioner Gillese addresses in her report is the myth that the harm caused by Wettlaufer's offense is really limited to her victims and their loved ones. And of course, the most direct and lasting harm was to the victims and their families. But the offenses also occurred in small communities where many people knew the victims, they knew their families, and it also devastated Wettlaufer's co-workers. When they testified, they all expressed shock and guilt for not noticing that anything was going on. They also described feeling extremely demoralized. They felt that Wettlaufer's offenses have put a stain on the entire nursing profession. Even the inspectors from the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care testified about the guilt they felt that this had happened on their watch. And more broadly, it shook public confidence. The inquiry received letters from people across the country who had loved ones in long-term care, who were sharing stories about the treatment that their loved ones were receiving. So it really had widespread effects, not only in those communities, but really across the sector.
Yeah, and those numbers that you mentioned are just staggering. And in fact, it seems we hear about serial killers in healthcare all the time. In fact, I think just the other day, I saw an article about a doctor who is accused of multiple murders. So yeah, this is definitely not a problem that can be ignored. Now, maybe you can tell us, what are the key findings of the inquiry?
So there were really 3 key findings. The first was that the offenses would not have been discovered if Wettlaufer hadn't confessed. And the reason that's important is that it shows that our long-term care system, as it's structured, did not detect the offenses. So we can't keep doing things the same way if we want to be able to detect and prevent things like this from happening in the future. The second is that no individual findings of misconduct were warranted. So in a public inquiry like this one, the commissioner has the power to make what's called a finding of misconduct. And Commissioner Gillese did not do that in this case. She said that although there were things that could have been done differently by various people, the offenses were really the result of systemic failings. And it's not helpful or productive to start pointing the finger in those circumstances, because really what we need is for all the stakeholders in the system to work together to improve it. The third finding was that the long-term care system is strained but not broken. As we've talked about, it's a really challenging environment to work in, but the people working in the system see it as a calling and they're dedicated to improving it. So for that reason, Commissioner Gillese said, we don't need to jettison the existing regulatory framework. It provides a good foundation and we can build upon that.
Yeah, and those are very interesting key findings, I think, because that's some of the same stuff that we're hearing related to some of the, that's not a full-blown public inquiry, but some of the examinations that have been done into long-term care related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, we're noting a lot of systemic issues that are contributing to some of the challenges that these, and with the statistics and the information you've provided already, it's already a challenging environment to be in. I can only imagine how much more difficult it is since the pandemic. So obviously, there must have been a number of recommendations that came out of this for a variety of different stakeholders. Can you share with our listeners the key recommendations aimed at the systemic issues that were identified?
Sure. So, of course, the commissioner made recommendations for specific stakeholders, but given her finding that systemic failings were responsible for what happened here, the bulk of the recommendations focus on 4 systemic issues she identified that need to be improved. So the first is the prevention of intentional harm by healthcare professionals. And what the commissioner says is that if we work on strengthening the long-term care system as a whole and promote excellence in resident care, that will help achieve that goal. And she also emphasized that there has to be one body that takes the leadership role for that. And she assigned that to the Ministry of, well, at the time, the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. It's now been separated. So it's the Ministry of Long-Term Care. And what she said is that the ministry should go beyond focusing on just ensuring compliance with the minimum standards in the legislation and really take the lead on promoting a drive for excellence by disseminating best practices, assisting homes that are struggling to achieve compliance, and staying abreast of new technologies. The second broad systemic recommendation focused on building awareness of the possibility that healthcare professionals could intentionally harm a patient, because you can't prevent, deter, or detect intentional harm if it doesn't even occur to you that it's a possibility. What's interesting is that other public inquiries have said the same thing. The Wettlaufer Inquiry in the United Kingdom said its most important recommendation was that people maintain awareness of the possibility that healthcare professionals could deliberately harm a patient. And the same thing was said by the Shipman Inquiry in the UK. That involved a doctor who was found to have killed more than 200 patients. They also emphasized the importance of awareness. The problem is that previous inquiries haven't really provided any guidance on how to build awareness. So in this case, Commissioner Gillese set out some detailed recommendations for building awareness. And what she did was she charged the Office of the Chief Coroner of Ontario with staying abreast of research in this area and sending key messages to all stakeholders in the system. And then those within the system, so colleges, universities, regulators, healthcare facilities, they're all responsible for training their staff and their students. The idea is that knowledge about this topic should be integrated into training on existing topics like professionalism and risk management. And in that way, it will keep this top of mind, because what's happened in the past is, as happened in this case, these things receive a lot of media attention right when they're going on, and then a few years pass and it fades from memory.
Right.
The third systemic recommendation focused on implementing strategies to deter healthcare professionals who might try to intentionally harm patients. And the report sets out a 3-pronged strategy. The first was for the ministry to give one-time grants to homes to use on one or more strategies to improve safety. So things like installing glass doors or windows on medication rooms, installing security cameras in common areas or in medication rooms, buying automated dispensing cabinets, or hiring a pharmacist or pharmacy technician to perform some medication-related functions. The second part of this strategy involved improving the medication incident analysis framework. And what the commissioner recommends is that all homes use a recognized incident analysis framework that explicitly considers the possibility of intentional harm. So backing up, when there's what's called a medication incident, the home has to take various steps to document and investigate it. So what the commissioner says is that all incidents of severe hypoglycemia and the use of rescue drugs like glucagon that are used to treat hypoglycemia should be analyzed under the medication incident analysis framework. The final prong of this recommendation focuses on increasing the number of staff in long-term care. And there have been many studies about staffing in long-term care over the years. And so what the commissioner did was she directed the government to study this issue and to table a report by July 31st, 2020, so on the 1-year anniversary of the conclusion of the inquiry, and to provide funding if it indicates that higher staffing is needed. And you alluded to the pandemic and its effects on long-term care, Dean, and we've heard that the government is going to be rolling out funding for example, more personal support workers to get trained because there really is a need for more staff.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Then the final systemic recommendation is to increase the number of death investigations in the long-term care setting. And that's really targeting the attitude that those in long-term care are expected to die. So what the commissioner says is that the forms long-term care homes submit to the coroner's office when a resident dies need to be revised so that it provides more useful information about the resident, their conditions, and their death. And she also recommends that the statistical models for predicting expected death rates be finalized by the ministry, and that the information from those models be used to trigger investigations when there's a higher than expected mortality rate in a home.
Now, those are really comprehensive findings and recommendations. It's nice to see that. And I can only imagine what a great experience this must have been for you. I mean, a difficult experience, but also one that was probably a great learning experience for you as well, just to be a part of such a large undertaking. And I'm sure this has been really interesting information for our audience, and the insights and the summary of the inquiry is really helpful. The implications, I think, for stakeholders, including regulators and employers of healthcare practitioners, are significant. And from what I'm hearing, just to summarize some of what you said, I mean, awareness seems to be a key takeaway. And in some ways, that can be a double-edged sword as we want to generate awareness and vigilance, but not a state of fear and paranoia. And I guess time will tell. All of this will be managed. And I'm sure, as I said before, this was a great experience for you to have played such an important role in the inquiry. And I think you should be commended for the role that you did play.
Well, thank you. It was a huge honor to be a part of the inquiry. And we had a really smart and dedicated team of people whose hard work went into the inquiry's report and recommendations. So it was really, as I said, really an honor to be part of a team that was doing such important work.
Right. And as we've already said, with the pandemic, long-term care really has continued to be front and center during the whole COVID-19 pandemic. Do you see any other parallels to the issues that the inquiry raised?
Definitely. And we touched on this earlier, but one of the inquiry's recommendations was that the government study the staffing levels in long-term care to determine whether more staff was needed for resident safety. And as we just discussed, the workload of staff in long-term care is incredibly heavy. And what we've seen during the pandemic is they've been stretched even more thinly. And we've seen the devastating results of that as stories have emerged about homes whose staff simply aren't able to keep up with the basic day-to-day care needed for residents because of the extra demands of the pandemic, or homes who have been so short-staffed that residents haven't gotten care at all. So the government's recent commitment to increasing the number of hours of direct care that each resident receives should result in an influx of staff to long-term care. But it's really tragic that it's taken this pandemic in order for a commitment like that to be made, because as I said, there have been studies going back decades, all of which have called for increased staffing in long-term care. So this wasn't something that should have come as a surprise to anyone. I think what it shows us is that the healthcare system and society as a whole hasn't sufficiently valued the work that staff in long-term care do. And that's reflected in the lower wages they receive as compared to people who work in hospitals. So this pandemic has really shown all of us how critical their work is, how difficult it is. And I hope that that results in their work being valued much more highly than it has been in the past.
And I can attest to this myself firsthand. Over the last 8 months, I've been involved in and personally conducted several investigations into some of the issues in long-term care homes related to the pandemic. It honestly hasn't been pleasant to see what's happened. And many of the issues that you've already discussed definitely were some of the findings I ended up making as a result of the investigations I did. So for what it's worth, I can attest to the validity of all of this. I do hope that we see an improvement down the road. Now, having said all of that, we've really just discussed a pretty heavy topic here. And I'd like to end our show on a little bit of a happier and lighter note. So let me ask you, what does Lara do for fun when she isn't dealing with such serious matters?
Well, during the pandemic, there hasn't been much fun to be had in the normal sense. So I've been doing what most people have been doing, watching a lot of Netflix or catching up on my reading list. But I also just welcomed a puppy home. So I've been keeping busy trying to keep him out of trouble.
It's funny. I think a lot of people have been welcoming puppies into their homes over the last year. We just recently got a puppy as well, and they definitely make things a little better, and they do wonders for our mental health. So I'm not surprised to hear that. We just love our little guy. So Lara, I really want to thank you for joining me today. You shared some great insights for our audience, and it really was a pleasure speaking with you. How do people get in touch with you?
So email or phone is great. My email address and my phone number are on Weir Foulds' website. It's lkinkartz@weirfoulds.com.
That's great, Lara. Well, once again, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Well, that's a wrap for today, everyone. Thanks again for tuning into the show. And please send us your feedback on how we're doing. As I've said before, our goal here, as with everything we do, is constant and never-ending improvement. So your feedback will help us immensely in improving this podcast. And just so you remember, all of our podcasts get linked to our website, bernardinc.com, and you can always reach me at dbernard@bernardinc.com or Dean Bernard on LinkedIn. So we'll see you next time on the We've Seen a Thing or Two podcast. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.